Well, good day. This is Sunday, February 11th. This is the Chronological Bible Series, Episode 6, that I'm calling the Sinai Covenant. This is following up on the one that we did last week, in which Moses confronted Pharaoh of Egypt and ended up, after the 10 plagues that God sent in judgment on Egypt, Moses was able to secure the freedom of the Israelite nation. So Exodus chapters 13 through 34 then follows their exit out of Egypt, out to the mountain of God, where they were to meet and actually receive the covenant instructions from God. So what I'm going to do is, in this video, is I'm just going to go through, like I do in the blog post, and just kind of talk through the sequence of events that occurs in this narrative. So it starts out, God, since this is right after the Passover, which I talked about last week, God reminds the Israelites that they are to consecrate to Him, dedicate to Him all of the firstborn males, not only their children, but their livestock. And to consecrate means to set apart for God's purposes. In the case of the male children, God does specify that they can redeem their children by basically substituting through a substitutionary sacrifice of another animal in the child's place. So he goes through and mentions that. He also talks about, in the context of the Passover celebration, that they are to then follow a week of feasting after that, called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And that was just to, again, remind them that they were not to have any yeast amongst them during that time period, representing the haste that they had to leave Egypt, and also representing sin or foreign influences that God doesn't want in their lives. Then he goes through and he actually leads them. The narrative talks about their journey, and God ends up leading them in a miraculous way through a pillar of cloud during the daytime. So if they traveled on the day, they could see that cloud in the distance and follow that. Or at night, if they were traveling, then the cloud would become luminous and become a pillar of fire. And that was how God led them. So he led them ultimately to the shores of the Red Sea. If you look at a world map, look at Egypt, the Red Sea is located east, a little bit southeast maybe from Egypt. And they end up on the shore and find that the Egyptian army now is pursuing them. They look back, they see them coming, and they are now terrified. And so God tells them through Moses, says, "Don't fear, I'm going to take care of you." Specifically in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13, it says, "Moses said to the people, 'Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.'" And what ends up transpiring is the Egyptian army gets there, and God ends up putting His pillar between the Israelites and the Egyptian army to hold them off. And then He parts the Red Sea. He parts the water. It says in Scripture that the water stands up on both sides, and the Israelites walk through on dry ground. And so as they proceed and get nearly across the Red Sea, then God ends up removing His pillar, and the Egyptian army is able to then begin to pursue them. As the army encroaches onto the dry land, surrounded by the wall of water, then God sends that water in to destroy the Egyptian army. And so He ends up defeating the Egyptian army at that point. Then we read more narrative passages that talks about how the Israelites encounter a spring. The spring has water, but it's water that's unfit to drink. It's called bitter water. And so God ends up showing Moses a stick, a piece of wood, that he is instructed to throw into the water, and the water is made drinkable. And then they go on, and a bit later the Israelites then complain about needing some bread, needing something to eat. And so God ends up providing some manna to them. And manna literally means "what is it" in Hebrew, and it was something that they had never seen before. God ends up, on every morning, He would provide this dew-like appearing substance. It was a flaky, almost, I picture it almost like a cornflake. It had a kind of a sweet honey taste to it, and they could bake it or boil it or whatever, but that was their sustenance. And God said, "I'm going to provide this for you for the time, all the time that you're out here." And it ended up that He provided this manna for them every single day, except on the Sabbath. He provided it every single day for the next 40 years until they got to the Promised Land. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. Then they came to another place in the desert, and they were very thirsty. They again complained to God, and God told Moses, "There's a rock here." It was close to Mount Sinai. God told Moses, go to that rock, use the staff that I had you use there in Egypt, and strike the rock, and water will come. So Moses did that, and God provided water for the people there in the desert. It also tells the story about the Amalekites. The Amalekites were a nomadic people, a tribe of people who, when the Israelites came across into what they felt like was their territory, they ended up attacking them. Moses, Aaron, and another man ended up going up on a hill to overlook the battlefield. And Moses would simply hold up his hands, and when he would hold up his hands, the Israelites would prevail and they would be winning. But if Moses got tired and his hands fell down, the Amalekites would win. And so Aaron and the other man ended up helping Moses by holding his hands up for the duration of the battle, until the Amalekites were defeated. So it's an interesting story there. And then we read also about Jethro. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. If you recall from last week, we talked about how Moses, when he had been exiled from Egypt when he was 40 years old, he went out into the desert and he met a girl out there, and he ended up marrying her. And this young lady's father was Jethro. And so now that Moses has brought the whole nation of Israel into the desert here, Jethro comes out, meets Moses, and ends up talking to him, and ends up observing the fact that Moses is having to spend so much of his time just hearing cases and hearing problems and people coming to him with questions and all of this, that he's just is worn out. It just takes all day, every day. And Jethro advises him basically to delegate. He says, Moses, there's no way that you can keep this up. You need to designate certain people to basically be captains or governors or whatever you call it, leaders of groups of people, and let them handle these cases, and you only deal with the hard ones. And so Moses ended up listening to that advice, and it helped him out. The Israelites ended up arriving after a number of days. They arrived at Mount Sinai, and it was there that God then provided the 10 Commandments to them. And a very interesting story about that. God actually told Moses to gather the people and have them prepare for this, and I'm going to actually come and speak in their hearing. And so he ended up giving the 10 Commandments where the entire nation was able to hear God speak. And so God went through those 10 Commandments. If you're not familiar with the 10 Commandments, they go like this. The first one is that you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, God was saying, I'm it. I'm number one. I'm not just the one of many. I am the one. I'm the only one that you are to worship. And then he says that you're not to make, commandment number 2, you're not to make any graven images. In other words, no physical representations of God or any other gods. You're not supposed to do that. God says, don't worship things, worship me instead. So don't make these idols or these objects. And then the third commandment is to not take the Lord's name in vain. Don't misuse his name. Don't you bear my name because we are in a covenant relationship, and don't make light of that. Don't misuse that. That's the third commandment. Fourth commandment, God said, I want you to keep the Sabbath every seventh day. I want you to set aside for worship, for rest, for reflection on the things that I've done, our relationship. And he said, I want you to keep that holy, keep it set aside. So those are the first 4 commandments. And then the last 6 commandments of the 10 relate more to interpersonal relationships. It's things like honor your father and your mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet or envy what your neighbor has. And so those 10 commandments in total actually fit into 2 categories that deal with your relationship to God and your relationship to the people around you. So once God has provided these 10 commandments, the people are actually terrified at this point. They have gotten scared from hearing God's voice. And so they end up telling Moses, tell God not to do that anymore. Let him talk to you, and then we'll listen to you. And so God ends up telling Moses, well, come on up here. And Moses goes up on the mountain by himself for the next 40 days, and God gives him further instruction. And basically, it's just elaboration on on worship and on interpersonal relationships that God goes through and deals with details about worship altars and how to deal with servants and slaves and making restitution and social justice, all that kind of stuff. It's interesting that that Jesus, I want to point to a passage in the New Testament. This comes out of Matthew chapter 22. It's a time when it says that a lawyer approached Jesus, and the term lawyer there is actually referring to someone who is an expert in God's law. And so he comes to Jesus, and this is again Matthew chapter 22, verse 35. This lawyer says, "Teacher, what is the great commandment of the law?" In other words, what's the best commandment of all of them? And Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." And then Jesus says, that is the great commandment and first commandment, and a second one is like it. He says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So Jesus was pointing out that really those 10 commandments and the rules and laws that are associated with them are all summed up with your relationship to God and your relationship to people. Love God and love the people around you. Then we go on and we read about that after Moses is done, after the 40 days, God actually ends up giving him not only these additional kind of expansions or clarifications of the law, but he also gives him details about the tabernacle. We're going to go through that next week because the passages at the end of Exodus actually outlines the construction of the pieces of the tabernacle that God reveals and shows Moses. So I'm going to go through that next week. But then God tells Moses he needs to go back down to the camp because the people have already broken the covenant. This is only after 40 days, a little over a month. And so Moses comes back to the camp and he finds that the people there have already convinced Aaron to take their gold offerings and mold them into a calf. And so Aaron ends up making this golden calf, and he said, "There's your God, and this is the God that brought you out of Egypt." And so the people are worshiping that, and they are committing all kinds of sins there in the camp already after God has just given them the 10 Commandments. Well, Moses, in his anger, he takes the tablets that God has provided him while he was up on the mountain. God had actually chiseled out and carved these 10 Commandments on these 2 tablets of stone. And Moses had these, and when he came down and he saw the people, he took the stones and he threw them on the ground and broke them, signifying the fact that the covenant has been broken. And God's judgment immediately began to pour out on the people, and Moses ultimately ended up interceding for the people and praying for them and coming before God and interceding. And so God ended up relenting somewhat from his judgment of the people at that point. And God told Moses, "All right, if you will recarve your own tablets, make a new set of tablets, bring them to me, then I will re-etch them and rewrite the commandments that I had on the first ones." So Moses ends up doing that, and he goes, and that ends this week's readings of the scriptures. One last thing that I just want to mention is just kind of a interesting side note or thought about this, that again, the focus in this passage was the 10 Commandments, but the 10 Commandments actually appear 2 times in Scripture. They appear in Exodus chapter 20, but they also appear over in Deuteronomy. And when we get to Deuteronomy, we'll read that passage and we'll see that. But what's interesting and significant about it is that the 10 Commandments were given at the institution of the covenant relationship with God. And immediately upon giving it, the Israelites broke them. And they threw away the covenant, basically, in worshiping that golden calf and so forth. And so God, as we're going to read about the next couple of weeks, God ends up judging them and punishing them for that, and they end up having to spend the next 40 years wandering around in this desert before they end up going to the promised land that God has given him. All of the people who were part of that original group end up dying. Everyone who was 20 years old or older ends up dying in the desert, and it's their children that then go into the promised land. And so the next time the 10 Commandments are given is to the children. And it's really interesting that these 2 instances of the 10 Commandments serve as bookends surrounding the disobedience and the failure of the Israelites. And what it does is it actually points to the New Testament. It points to the fact that Jesus came and fulfilled the 10 Commandments. He's the first one who has ever lived, and the only one who has ever lived, who has been able to completely obey and follow the explicit instructions and obedience of God. And in fact, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapter 5, he said this, he said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus was very clear there in saying that to the people of his day, this was 1,500 or so years after the initial commandments were given, he was making the statement to the people that unless you are more righteous than these religious leaders of yours, who are arguably the most righteous people that were in existence at the time, Jesus said, unless you're more righteous than that, you're never going to get into heaven. In other words, nobody's going to get into heaven unless you fulfill the requirements of the law. But yet Jesus says, I did that. I was able to do that. And ultimately, Jesus ended up being able to substitute himself, just like the consecration of the firstborn that I talked about a little while ago. Jesus substituted himself in our place so that we could be redeemed and be able to fulfill the expectations of God. It's a beautiful picture. It's a picture that we're going to continue to examine and unfold as we get through the rest of Scripture. So that's it for this week. Next week we're going to be looking at the last bit of Exodus, chapters 35 through 40. And then the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, called the Pentateuch, the law of Moses. When we finish Exodus, we're actually going to skip Leviticus for a bit, and we're going to jump into Numbers and look at Numbers chapter 7 through 9, which outlines a little bit more detail about the worship practices that the Israelites were supposed to follow. And then we're going to jump back to Leviticus, which the entire book of Leviticus is about worship and the job of the Levitical priests. And so we're going to start looking at that next week, Leviticus 1 through 8. So 3 different Bible books that we're going to be spending some time in next week. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I appreciate it if you would subscribe to this channel, like the video, all of that stuff. If you look down there in the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll be able to see where I have the watchmakerspulse.com link there, and you can go and search that out, and it's got all of the blog posts. It's got the links to my YouTube channel and my Facebook and my LinkedIn page and all of that. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.